Forget what your history teacher told you. America's story, the one neatly printed between two glossy covers, was always more fairy tale than fact. Heroes wore whiter hats, villains spoke in simpler accents, and the blood, well, that part was politely edited out for your comfort. You remember it, rows of desks, the smell of chalk and dry paper. You're 12 years old, staring at a smiling illustration of pilgrims shaking hands with friendly Indians, and you think, wow, that was nice of them. No one mentions that within a few years, most of those friends would be dead, relocated, or renamed to fit the narrative. Your textbook didn't lie outright, it just forgot to mention things. The same way you forget about the dishes in the sink when company comes over. You were told America was built by bravery and hard work. To us. Just not always by the people who got the credit. So tonight we're going to do something different. We're going to open that old textbook again, the one with the coffee stains and patriotic illustrations, and read between the lines. It might get uncomfortable. It might ruin a few childhood memories. But hey, better late than never. Now, let's start where every American education begins. The man who discovered a continent already full of people. You wake up to the sound of waves. The year is 1492, and apparently, you're about to discover a place where millions of people already live. Funny how that works. You were told this story as a triumph. A brave Italian man, armed with faith and a few questionable maps, sails west to prove the world isn't flat. Cue the triumphant music. Cue the parades. Cue the annual schoolcraft project where you glue cotton balls to the Santa Maria. What they didn't tell you, or maybe they did, but you were too young to notice, is that Columbus didn't discover America. He never even set foot on the continent. He landed in the Bahamas, called the locals Indians, because geography is hard, and immediately started writing letters about how great they'd be as servants. That part doesn't make it onto the bulletin board next to the construction paper pilgrim hats. You remember learning the rhyme. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. What they left out was the sequel. He kidnapped, enslaved, and tortured too. Not quite as catchy, but considerably more accurate. The textbooks like to frame him as a visionary, a man who opened up a new world. What they don't mention is that the new world had a population somewhere between 50 and 100 million before he got there. Cities, trade networks, agriculture, civilizations, all functioning quite well without European input. Columbus didn't discover anything. He interrupted. You can almost picture it. A classroom globe spins beneath fluorescent light, your teacher's fingers stopping over the Caribbean. This, she says proudly, is where it all began. And you wonder now, what began exactly? Trade? Colonization? The centuries-long industry of pretending conquest was exploration? The man himself wrote about it. He described the native people as gentle, generous, and unarmed. Then, in the same sentence, he noted they'd make excellent slaves. Efficiency, apparently, was his strong suit. But you were never told that. You were told about the bravery, the courage, the sheer audacity of sailing west into the unknown. Which sure, credit where it's due. But bravery without morality is just well-organized cruelty. You might recall how every October, his name gets dragged out again. Parades, speeches, awkward debates on social media. Some cities quietly switch the signs to Indigenous Peoples' Day. Others dig their heels in, defending a man who couldn't find Asia and left a trail of atrocities instead. Old myths die hard, especially the ones that make you feel patriotic. There's a strange comfort in believing the past was cleaner, simpler, heroic. It makes the present easier to justify. If Columbus was a hero, then colonization was destiny. If colonization was destiny, then everything that followed was just progress. That's the story the textbook sells you. A neat beginning to a messy empire. And somewhere, deep in that story, you were meant to feel proud. Proud of the discovery, proud of the flag, proud of the promise of a new world. You weren't supposed to feel the nausea that comes from realizing that discovery for one group meant erasure for another. So no, Columbus didn't discover America. He stumbled into it, misnamed it, and set it on fire. The only thing he really discovered was how profitable cruelty could be. Congrats! You've passed lesson 1. You can go ahead and close your childhood textbook now. The cover's already starting to peel. We've got 39 more myths to unlearn, and somehow, they only get worse. You open the page, and there they are. Pilgrims in tall black hats with buckles, smiling politely, shaking hands with friendly Indians, in a scene so tidy it could be a greeting card. It's Thanksgiving, every day, in the simplified world of your textbook. You were meant to think. They came for freedom. They were brave. They were good. Except, not exactly. Let's back up. You're in the early 1600s. England is a place where religion isn't just personal, it's dangerous. Some folks want the Church of England to be the only church. Others, not so much. The Pilgrims? They didn't exactly flee tyranny for the sake of liberty. They fled intolerance, yes, but only for themselves, and only the version of Christianity they liked. You picture them on the Mayflower, cramped, seasick, dreaming of a land where they could worship without interference. Romantic, right? The textbooks say, seeking religious freedom. Spoiler alert, it's not that simple. They didn't extend that freedom to everyone. Women? Still subject to strict patriarchal rules. Non-Puritans? Nope. Indigenous peoples? Forget it. Your history class left that part out. Conveniently, the pages only had room for polite handshakes and cornucopias. When they landed at Plymouth Rock, they weren't greeted with bouquets of flowers. They were welcomed cautiously by the Wampanoag people who had lived there for centuries. And why were the Wampanoag cautious? Because they'd seen strangers before, strange, armed, disease-ridden strangers. But the textbook skipped this. It's easier to depict a harmonious, first Thanksgiving than a complex negotiation of survival and power. Life for the Pilgrims was hard, don't get me wrong. Freezing winters, disease, starvation. Some of that hardship was self-inflicted, sure, but the textbook makes it feel heroic, noble. You were supposed to admire their endurance, not question the ethical cost of starting fresh on someone else's land. They signed treaties. They fought wars. They enslaved some. They displaced many more. Religious freedom? For them. For everyone else? Not so much. The cozy classroom image of pilgrims and natives breaking bread is mostly fiction. It's a myth so tidy it could be laminated. You think about that phrase, seeking religious freedom. What it really meant, we'll have freedom as long as it doesn't inconvenience us or challenge our beliefs. There's a lesson in there somewhere. But in your 4th grade classroom, it was all turkey and gratitude. And, of course, the story gets repeated every November. Children sing songs about the Pilgrims' courage, families share pumpkin pie, and no one mentions the land that was already occupied or the people who taught them to survive their first brutal winter. You weren't taught the full story because it's messy. Patriotism and morality are easier to swallow when you don't have to chew on the consequences. It's comforting to imagine a world where the Pilgrims' arrival was a story of bravery and unity. The reality? It was survival, negotiation, and displacement. Complex. Human. So next time someone thanks the Pilgrims for religious freedom, remember this. They sought it, yes, but only for themselves. And they did so on land already full of people who had their own stories, their own beliefs, and their own claim to survival. Congratulations. You've unlearned myth number 2. If you're feeling slightly queasy, that's normal. It only gets more uncomfortable from here. You open your textbook and there it is. A neat, heroic story. Colonists, oppressed by the distant king, rise together in righteous rebellion. They fight for freedom, democracy, and liberty, ideals so pure they practically sparkle on the page. You're meant to feel proud. You're meant to believe that every colonist was a patriot, standing up for justice. Now, let's step into that world. It's the late 1700s. The colonies are vast, diverse, and messy. Some people are wealthy landowners. Some are farmers barely scraping by. Some are enslaved, some are indigenous, and some are immigrants with no particular loyalty to a king thousands of miles away. You're there too, in the middle of it. The unified fight for liberty. It looks less like a team of heroes and more like a chaotic neighborhood feud with muskets. Some colonists want revolution. Some want to stay loyal to England. Loyalists, they're called, though no one in your textbook ever tells you that loyalists often made up a third of the population. Think about it. A third of the people around you are actively rooting against the cause you're being told is sacred. And what about the enslaved population? Many were promised freedom if they fought for the British. The revolutionaries claimed liberty, but only for white property-owning men. Women? They were expected to cheer quietly from the sidelines while men wrote letters about freedom. You picture the Boston Tea Party. Patriots dumping tea into the harbor. It looks noble in pictures, a symbol of defiance. The reality? Most participants were a mix of radicals, opportunists, and bored drunks. Some were motivated by ideology. Some were motivated by the chance to smash someone else's property and call it patriotism. And the fighting itself? Hardly unified. Soldiers from different colonies often mistrusted each other. Supplies were scarce. Soldiers went hungry, ill-equipped, and untrained. The myth of a coordinated, noble army marching against tyranny is comforting, but it's fiction. Chaos, disorganization, and sheer luck played as big a role as courage or principles. Then there's George Washington, the poster child of the Revolution. Your textbook paints him as flawless, a man of virtue and vision. But step back. He was brilliant, yes, but also deeply human. He struggled with morale, mutinies, and chronic shortages. His victories were sometimes accidental. And let's not forget, he owned slaves. Liberty, apparently, didn't apply to everyone. You might feel a little dizzy thinking about all this. The neat story you learned as a child, one of heroism and unity, suddenly looks like a patchwork of self-interest, luck, and selective morality. History is rarely tidy. Your textbook was just keeping it simple. Patriotism has a way of smoothing over inconvenient truths. It turns disagreements into consensus. It hides the stories of those left behind, loyalists forced to flee, enslaved people promised freedom by the crown, women running households and businesses in the men's absence. The fight for liberty wasn't universal. It was selective, incomplete, and deeply imperfect. So the next time you picture the revolution as a grand, unified struggle for justice, try to remember, it wasn't. It was complicated. Sometimes ugly. And strangely human in ways that don't fit neatly on a classroom poster. Congrats! You've now unlearned myth number 3. If your head feels heavy, don't worry, that's just the weight of reality pressing down on all those heroic images you were fed. And yes, the next myth is going to make things feel even messier. You open your textbook to the Founding Fathers, quills in hand, solemnly debating the fate of a new nation. The illustrations show dignified men in powdered wigs, nodding thoughtfully, embodying wisdom and fairness. You were meant to believe. Here is the blueprint of liberty, perfectly designed for democracy. And for some reason, it looks like everyone was equally considered. Now, let's step into that room. It's 1787, Philadelphia. The air smells faintly of ink, sweat, and cigar smoke. Although cigars were probably rare, the point is, you can almost taste the intensity of negotiation. There's a lot at stake. How to balance state and federal power, how to avoid tyranny, and how to make a government that would last longer than the average New York draft horse. You look closer at the men drafting the document. Wealthy. Landowners. And yes, mostly slave owners. Not exactly a cross-section of the population. Native Americans? Women? Enslaved people? Immigrants without property? Sorry, your opinions were not solicited. Your textbook probably says the Constitution created checks and balances. It did. Sort of. It also created a system where power often stayed in the hands of the privileged few. Congress and the presidency? Limited power at first, a good thing if you don't like mob rule. The Supreme Court? Appointed for life. And then there's the Electoral College. Ah yes, the much celebrated institution designed to ensure that the masses didn't accidentally vote in someone inconvenient. Democracy, yes, but with a side of elite control. Slavery. Your textbook might whisper that word, almost as an afterthought. In reality, the Constitution protected it. The 3/5 compromise? A polite way to say, some human beings count as less than a hold. Freedom and equality, but only if you were a white male property owner. The rest of the country? Your textbook leaves them in the margins, literally and figuratively. Then there's the process itself. The Constitution wasn't unanimously adored. Some states refused to ratify it without guarantees of individual rights, the Bill of Rights. Even then, compromise was messy, the debates bitter, and the future uncertain. Not quite the tidy, perfect plan for democracy your history class implied. You picture the delegates congratulating themselves after signing. It feels noble. It looks noble. But the reality? They were a group of men negotiating their own survival, power, and influence, while carefully sidestepping issues they didn't want to resolve. It was brilliant, yes. But perfect? Far from it. Fast forward a few decades. The system they created was already showing cracks, unequal representation, disenfranchisement, systemic bias, and ongoing struggles over who truly counted as a citizen. History isn't tidy, your textbook lied. It's full of loopholes and compromises that still haunt the present. So next time you imagine the Constitution as a flawless masterpiece, remember this. It was a start, a clever, pragmatic start. But it was designed by humans, for humans, and humans are rarely perfect. Congratulations. You've unlearned myth number 4. Take a deep breath. Because if you thought the revolution was messy, the founding of the government is another level of complicated. You open your textbook and see a paragraph about freedom. The revolution ended, independence was won, and naturally, you assume that slavery, the obvious contradiction to liberty, faded into history. It didn't. Let's set the scene. It's 1783. The war is over. The colonies are now free states, proudly waving flags that promise life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can almost smell the celebratory gunpowder, the roasted meats, the hope in the air. Except, there's a faint, persistent stench you're not meant to notice. It's coming from the plantations, the fields, the homes where people remain in chains. You were probably taught that slavery was ended gradually. Spoiler alert, gradual is a polite word for still happening, still brutal, and still legal for decades. Northern states did start to pass emancipation laws, but even there, freedom came slowly. Children of enslaved people were often bound until their 20s. Some states required decades-long apprenticeships, which basically meant working for free until the state felt you'd earned your liberty. Legal loopholes abounded, and your textbook glosses over all of it. Down south, it's a different story. The economy is booming: cotton, tobacco, rice. Slavery wasn't just a labor system. It was the foundation of wealth and power. And no moral awakening or revolutionary rhetoric was going to dismantle it anytime soon. You might think of George Washington, the revolutionary hero. Great man, right? Except he was still a slave owner at the time of his death. Freedom for some, property for others. And Thomas Jefferson? Drafted the words, "All men are created equal," while owning hundreds of enslaved people. Textbooks like to nod at this contradiction and move on. You weren't supposed to linger too long. Then there's the horrifying practical reality. Even in the North, many freed people were left destitute, without land, education, or legal protection. Abolition didn't mean equality. It meant freedom from chains, yes, but freedom to navigate a society that didn't want you. The myth of quick emancipation erases all the struggle, violence, and suffering that persisted. Meanwhile, the South entrenched slavery deeper. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made the system even more profitable. Slavery wasn't fading, it was expanding. And every attempt to compromise politically, like the 3/5 Compromise or the Missouri Compromise, reminded the country that liberty was not universal. It applied selectively, conveniently, and mostly to white men. You can almost imagine the textbooks trying to make sense of it. A few sentences, a polite timeline, a heading like Progress Toward Freedom. It sounds tidy. It's not. Freedom after the revolution was messy, slow, and for many, still a distant dream. So the next time you picture the revolution as a clean break from slavery, remember this. Chains weren't broken overnight. Freedom was a battle that would take generations, sometimes decades, sometimes lifetimes. And the myth of instant liberation is just another way to make a complicated, painful history easier to swallow. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 5. Take a moment. The next one? It's going to make you question what you thought you knew about the founding fathers' morality. You open your textbook and see a map. A squiggly line stretching across the United States, labeled politely, Trail of Tears. The words hint at sorrow, loss, tragedy. You were meant to think, how unfortunate, how regrettable. But surely it was an accident, a mistake in the march of progress. Now, step into the reality. It's the 1830s. The U.S. government has decided that certain lands, fertile, strategically located and desirable, are needed for American progress. Who occupies them? Native Americans. Not just anyone. Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, Choctaw. People who farmed, hunted, traded, lived. People with homes, traditions, and sovereignty. You weren't told that part. The government's solution? Forced removal. Entire communities uprooted from ancestral lands. No negotiation, no real consent. And yes, the term Trail of Tears is actually understated. Thousands died from disease, starvation, exposure. Some estimates suggest 1/4 of the Cherokee population perished. Textbooks often gloss over that number with a sentence or two, because who wants to linger on genocide in a high school classroom? You picture the journey, families traveling hundreds of miles, children weak from hunger, elders falling behind, the sick abandoned or carried on wagons. Snow, mud, heat, rain, conditions meant to break bodies and spirits alike. And for what? So settlers could claim the land and expand cotton production, so a government could expand power, so the concept of manifest destiny could gain traction. Now, your textbook might frame it as unfortunate but necessary, a neutral, sanitized phrasing that makes the nation look responsible and heroic. But there's nothing neutral about forcing people to walk through death. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate policy, justified by laws like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson. Jackson, by the way, is still celebrated in textbooks for his populist leadership, even as he engineered mass suffering. And the myth continues today. Many Americans repeat the phrase, tragic mistake, as if the tears were unavoidable or the deaths incidental. But when you peel back the layers, it's hard to call it anything other than premeditated displacement. The government didn't miscalculate. It executed a plan, and millions of lives were upended because of it. You think about how history textbooks love neat narratives. A little sorrow, a touch of villainy, a moral lesson, and then the page turns. The scale of suffering, the systemic oppression, and the lasting trauma get compressed into paragraphs that don't disrupt the comfort of national pride. And that's exactly the point. The Trail of Tears is easier to teach when it's framed as a tragedy instead of a crime. But the reality? Crime, policy, and bureaucracy combined to devastate people who had lived on the land for generations. Every mile marched was a mile of stolen sovereignty, stolen dignity, and stolen lives. So, the next time someone calls it a tragic mistake, remember this. Mistakes are accidental. The Trail of Tears was intentional. The scale of planning, the cold logic of removal, and the bureaucratic efficiency of death leave no room for the comforting idea that it was just an error. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 6. And yes, the next chapter will take us even deeper into the selective memory of American history, where oppression is neatly footnoted and heroism is generously highlighted. You flip the page and see rolling hills, covered wagons, and smiling pioneers. Your textbook calls it manifest destiny, a noble journey of progress, civilization, and opportunity. The lesson is simple. Americans moved west, tamed the land, and built a nation. You were meant to think, how brave, How inspiring. How inevitable. Step closer to. It's the mid-1800s. The United States is expanding, but the land isn't empty. It's filled with indigenous nations, the Sioux, Cheyenne, Apache, and hundreds of others, who have lived, farmed, hunted, and thrived there for centuries. The textbooks skip over that inconvenient detail. You imagine the wagons, the pioneers, the oxen pulling wooden wheels through mud and prairie. Romantic, right? Except, as settlers advanced, indigenous communities were pushed off their lands. Negotiations? Often forced. Treaties? Frequently broken. And wars? Brutal, systematic, sometimes genocidal. The textbooks will give you a line or two about conflicts with Native Americans, then move on. You're not supposed to linger on the massacres. The myth insists expansion brought progress. And in some ways, yes, towns were built, railroads laid, agriculture expanded. But progress came at a price. Tribes were uprooted, traditional economies destroyed, sacred lands desecrated. Entire ways of life were erased to make room for settlers, railroads, and the promise of the American dream. You picture John Wayne-style heroes crossing the plains. Now imagine the people being displaced, families walking barefoot, carrying what little they could, starving, sick, terrified. Winter, disease, and violence accompanied them every step of the way. The textbooks never linger on their suffering, only the bravery of the newcomers. And the government? It passed laws like the Homestead Act and sent the army to protect settlers. Translated: enforce expansion, suppress resistance, eliminate obstacles. Indigenous peoples weren't considered citizens, they were obstacles. Your textbook quietly omits that little moral note. Even the supposed economic benefits were uneven. Wealth and land flowed almost exclusively to white settlers and speculators. The displaced? Left with nothing but the memory of what they'd lost. And yet, somehow, the narrative remains. Westward expansion equals good. A simple equation. Convenient. False. You think about the maps. Textbooks show neat lines of state borders, dots for towns, arrows for railroads. What they don't show: massacres, forced removals, broken treaties, burned villages. History is messy. The textbooks love to make it tidy. So, next time someone praises Manifest Destiny, remember this. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't fair. And the benefits were selective, handed out only to those already in power. Congrats. You've unlearned myth number 7. Take a deep breath. Because the next chapter will show how America turned inequality into law, again and again. You flip the page and see rolling hills, covered wagons, and smiling pioneers. Your textbook calls it Manifest Destiny, a noble journey of progress, civilization, and opportunity. The lesson is simple. Americans moved west, tamed the land, and built a nation. You were meant to think, how brave, how inspiring, how inevitable. Step closer. It's the mid-1800s. The United States is expanding, but the land isn't empty. It's filled with indigenous nations, the Sioux, Cheyenne, Apache, and hundreds of others, who have lived, farmed, hunted, and thrived there for centuries. The textbooks skip over that inconvenient detail. You imagine the wagons, the pioneers, the oxen pulling wooden wheels through mud and prairie. Romantic, right? Except, as settlers advanced, indigenous communities were pushed off their lands. Negotiations? Often forced. Treaties? Frequently broken. And wars? Brutal, systematic, sometimes genocidal. The textbooks will give you a line or two about conflicts with Native Americans, then move on. You're not supposed to linger on the massacres. The myth insists expansion brought progress. And in some ways, yes, towns were built, railroads laid, agriculture expanded. But progress came at a price. Tribes were uprooted, traditional economies destroyed, sacred lands desecrated. Entire ways of life were erased to make room for settlers, railroads, and the promise of the American dream. You picture John Wayne-style heroes crossing the plains. Now imagine the people being displaced, families walking barefoot, carrying what little they could, starving, sick, terrified. Winter, disease, and violence accompanied them every step of the way. The textbooks never linger on their suffering, only the bravery of the newcomers. And the government? It passed laws like the Homestead Act and sent the army to protect settlers. Translated: enforce expansion, suppress resistance, eliminate obstacles. Indigenous peoples weren't considered citizens, they were obstacles. Your textbook quietly omits that little moral note. Even the supposed economic benefits were uneven. Wealth and land flowed almost exclusively to white settlers and speculators. The displaced? Left with nothing but the memory of what they'd lost. And yet, somehow, the narrative remains. Westward expansion equals good. A simple equation. Convenient. False. You think about the maps. Textbooks show neat lines of state borders, dots for towns, arrows for railroads. What they don't show: massacres, forced removals, broken treaties, burned villages. History is messy. The textbooks love to make it tidy. So, next time someone praises Manifest Destiny, remember this. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't fair. And the benefits were selective, handed out only to those already in power. Congrats. You've unlearned myth number 7. Take a deep breath. Because the next chapter will show how America turned inequality into law, again and again. You open your textbook and see the word Reconstruction in bold letters. The Civil War is over. Slavery is abolished. You're meant to think, finally, freedom for everyone. Justice restored. Simple. Satisfying. Step closer. It's 1865. Formerly enslaved people are technically free. They have rights on paper. They can vote. They can marry legally. They can own property. Your textbook nods at this progress in a neat paragraph. But you weren't taught the rest, the part about the world trying desperately to pull that freedom away. In reality, Reconstruction was a fragile, contested experiment. Southern states passed black codes almost immediately. Freedmen faced restrictions on movement, employment, and political activity. It wasn't illegal slavery, it was its shadow. A system designed to maintain white supremacy while pretending nothing had changed. You imagine a freed family in the South. They celebrate emancipation. Hope is alive. But soon they encounter violence, mobs, lynchings, intimidation. The Ku Klux Klan emerges. Your textbook might mention it briefly, a footnote at most. You weren't meant to dwell on how terror was institutionalized to control a population that was supposedly free. Politics offered some hope. African Americans were elected to local, state, and even federal offices. It was extraordinary and terrifying to the old Southern power structure. So white supremacists resorted to violence, bribery, and voter suppression to reclaim control. Your textbook, naturally, simplifies this to Reconstruction eventually failed. That sentence barely scratches the surface of thousands of lives under siege. Then there's economics. Freedom without resources is, well, not freedom at all. Sharecropping and tenant farming trapped many African Americans in cycles of debt and dependency. Land promised in speeches was rarely delivered. Contracts often favored former slave owners. The textbook might call it a difficult transition. The reality, exploitation disguised as opportunity. You picture classrooms teaching Reconstruction like a single chapter in a textbook. 2 or 3 pages. Political cartoons. Dates to memorize. All the human suffering, courage, and resilience is condensed into tidy sentences. Reconstruction ended in 1877. Which, yes, is technically true. But it erases decades of systemic oppression that followed. And yet, the myth persists. Reconstruction is often remembered as a time when freedom was granted, fully and permanently. In truth, freedom was hard-won, incomplete, and constantly under threat. The country didn't just move forward. It wavered, retreated, and entrenched racial hierarchies for another century. So next time you picture Reconstruction as a triumphant moment, remember this. Freedom was partial. Justice was fragile. And the textbook version is just that, a sanitized, simplified story that avoids inconvenient truths. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 9. Take a breath, because the next chapter will reveal how the promise of equality was quietly replaced by a system of segregation, oppression, and legalized discrimination. You open your textbook and see the familiar phrase, Jim Crow laws enforced, separate but equaled. You're meant to think, segregation was unfortunate, yes, but orderly. Legal. Polite. Equal, even. It's the kind of phrase that sounds harmless, almost bureaucratic. You were taught to nod, memorize the dates, and move on. Now, step into reality. It's the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Jim Crow isn't just a law. It's a system. A web of rules, customs, and violence designed to keep African Americans powerless, poor, and socially inferior. You picture the signs, whites only, colored entrance. A water fountain, a restroom, a theater seat, every space labeled with invisible chains. Textbooks might say segregation. But they rarely convey the humiliation, the constant negotiation of safety, the daily reminders that freedom and equality were illusions. And equal? Hada. Schools for white children received funds, books, teachers. Schools for black children? Often in shacks, with used or discarded materials. Hospitals, transportation, even cemeteries were segregated. Separate wasn't equal. It was a method of systemic oppression masquerading as law. Violence was always nearby. Lynchings, beatings, intimidation, rarely prosecuted. You weren't meant to dwell on it. Your textbook might mention a few tragic events in passing, but the scope of terror was immense and methodical. Even politics was rigged. Voting restrictions, literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, ingenious in their cruelty. Black Americans were technically citizens, but the state ensured they had no political voice. Separate but equal? More like separate and silenced. You can imagine life, a black family walking to school under the watchful eyes of hostile neighbors. A young man dreaming of opportunity but blocked by law and custom. A teacher forced to stretch a single, tattered textbook across a classroom of 20 children. Your textbook will condense this into one paragraph. The lived reality? Daily, grinding, systemic degradation. And the mythology persists. Separate but equal sounds like compromised. In reality, it was oppression dressed in legal language. It created generations of disadvantage, poverty, and trauma, the effects of which ripple to this day. So the next time you hear someone mention Jim Crow as merely a legal technicality, remember this. It was never just a law. It was a system engineered to enforce inequality and maintain dominance. Equal? Not even close. Separate? Definitely. Congrats. You've unlearned myth number 10. Take a moment. Stretch your mind. Because the next section will show how the myth of racial equality persisted even as laws and customs entrenched discrimination further. You open your textbook and see Martin Luther King Jr. standing at the Lincoln Memorial, delivering the I Have a Dream speech. The picture radiates hope. The caption suggests, Civil Rights won, equality achieved. You were meant to close the book and feel that history had neatly corrected its mistakes. Step closer. It's the 1950s and 1960s. The civil rights movement is alive, powerful, courageous. Marches, sit-ins, boycotts, speeches, millions of people risking their lives to demand justice. A monumental achievement, yes. But textbooks like to end the story at 1968 as if the dream was fully realized. Reality is far messy. The Civil Rights Act of 1964? Landmark legislation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965? Monumental. Yet systemic racism didn't disappear. Policies like redlining, employment discrimination, and unequal schooling persisted. Neighborhoods remained segregated by law and custom. Your textbook moves quickly from laws passed to freedom secured, skipping decades of ongoing oppression. You picture a young African-American child walking into a newly integrated school. The building is technically open to everyone, but the teachers may be hostile, the students unwelcoming, the textbook still whitewashed. And outside? Economic disparity, police brutality, and community resistance make equality a distant ideal. Even victories are selective. The heroes of the movement are celebrated, rightly so. But they weren't enough to dismantle the structures built over centuries. Racism didn't vanish because laws changed. It adapted. It moved, disguised itself, and persisted in subtle, systemic ways. Textbooks love the tidy narrative: protest, legislation, victory. It's satisfying. It allows a sense of closure. You remember it as a story with heroes and an ending. Reality? It's ongoing, complex, and frustrating. And the myth continues today. People cite the civil rights movement as proof that racism is over, ignoring disparities in wealth, education, incarceration, and policing. Equality on paper doesn't always mean equality in life. The textbook version masks the persistence of prejudice behind the glow of monumental speeches and marches. You might think, then, that racism is only individual prejudice. It's systemic. It's built into housing, banking, voting, criminal justice, education, every layer of society. And while the civil rights movement made monumental strides, it didn't dismantle centuries of deeply rooted inequality. So the next time someone tells you racism ended with civil rights legislation, remember this. It didn't. It evolved. And ignoring that evolution makes it easier to believe in a national myth of fairness that never fully existed. Congrats. You've unlearned myth number 11. Take a breath. Because the next myth will show how America's progress often looks like a series of carefully packaged illusions. You open your textbook and see a smiling factory worker, a small business owner, maybe even a farmer tending neat rows of corn. The caption reads something like, "In America, hard work leads to success." You were meant to nod, feel inspired, maybe even believe that if you just tried hard enough, anything was possible. Step closer. It's the late 19th and early 20th centuries. America is industrializing, booming with railroads, steel, and oil. Opportunities are everywhere, if you're the right color, the right gender, and the right social class. You imagine yourself working in a factory. The hours are long. The air is thick with smoke and soot. Machines roar. Fingers are lost. Lives are shortened. Yet somehow, textbooks paint it as hard work builds character. Health, safety, fair pay? Not so much. Then there's inequality. The Gilded Age was less about reward for effort and more about wealth concentrated in a few hands. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt. The rest? Struggling, exploited, living in tenements, sending children to work instead of school. The American dream existed mostly in illustration form. Even policies that supposedly reward work were selective. Union organizing? Suppressed violently. Minimum wage? A concept decades away. Women and people of color? Often excluded entirely from opportunity. Your textbook prefers the neat image of reward and merit, leaving out systemic barriers that made success nearly impossible for most. Fast forward to the modern era. Hard work still doesn't guarantee security. Automation, outsourcing, corporate consolidation, and student debt make the myth persist but the reality harsher. Some people work 2 jobs and never escape poverty. Others inherit wealth, connections, or advantage and succeed with minimal effort. The narrative in textbooks rarely acknowledges these realities. You can almost hear the lectures. Work hard, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. A fine moral, a tidy lesson. But the boots aren't always on your feet. The ladder isn't always sturdy. The rungs are missing, warped, or reserved for someone else. Textbooks love stories where effort equals reward because it's reassuring. It implies fairness, morality, and opportunity. Reality? Luck, privilege, and systemic inequality are just as important, sometimes more so. The myth teaches faith in the system. The truth forces you to question it. So the next time you hear hard work guarantees success, remember this. It often guarantees exhaustion. Sometimes it guarantees disappointment. Rarely does it guarantee fairness. Congrats. You've unlearned myth number 12. Breathe. because the next myth will show how American history often rewards myth-making over truth-telling, especially when it comes to heroes. You open your textbook and see portraits of solemn men in dark suits, faces stern but wise. The captions praise leadership, integrity, vision. You're meant to think, our presidents are paragons of honesty and virtue, guiding the nation with a steady hand. Simple, reassuring, comforting. Step closer. It's easy to forget that a president is, first and foremost, human. And humans are messy, ambitious, self-interested, sometimes corrupt, often flawed. History textbooks rarely dwell on this. They prefer tidy narratives where Washington is flawless, Lincoln is saintly, and the moral lessons are obvious. Take Andrew Jackson, for example. Hero of the common man? Sure. Owner of slaves? Definitely. Enforcer of the Trail of Tears? Absolutely. Textbooks might include one sentence about his policies toward Native Americans, sandwiched between tales of duels and frontier bravery. The moral complexities are erased. Or think about Richard Nixon. Your history book probably highlights the Watergate scandal, maybe mentions resignation. But the human detail, paranoia, manipulation, abuse of power, is often compressed into a footnote or a chapter title. Presidential myth favors accomplishment over accountability. Even Lincoln, celebrated as the great emancipator, had moral contradictions. He delayed action against slavery for political strategy. He suspended habeas corpus. He made decisions that caused immense suffering in the name of preserving the Union. You weren't taught the messy ethical calculus behind the greatness. You picture the classroom exercise. Memorize the presidents, their dates, their major acts. It's tidy. It reinforces trust in the office. You feel a sense of continuity, stability, and morality. Reality? The office is a stage for ambition, compromise, and sometimes outright deception. And it isn't limited to distant history. Recent presidents? Scandals, ethical lapses, and political manipulation abound. Yet textbooks condense complexity into chapters on policy, election, achievement, rarely scrutinizing morality. The myth persists because citizens are comforted by the idea of principled leadership. The truth is inconvenient, unsettling, and often undermines patriotic pride. You might think, surely, some presidents are honest. Occasionally. But history rarely treats honesty and morality as guarantees. Policy decisions, political strategy, and personal ambition often collide with ethics. Textbooks prefer simplicity over nuance, so the messy reality is left for footnotes and the curious few. So the next time you memorize presidential achievements, remember this. The office does not automatically confer virtue. History tends to highlight victories and overlook flaws. The myth of moral, incorruptible leadership is comforting, but incomplete. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 13. Sit back, relax, and prepare. Because the next myth will reveal how the narrative of American wars often prioritizes heroism over human cost. You open your textbook and see flags waving, soldiers marching, and heroic captions like, "Fighting for liberty and democracy." You're meant to think, every American war is righteous, noble, and morally unquestionable. It's neat, satisfying, and patriotic. Exactly the story that keeps classrooms quiet and proud. Step closer. Reality is messy. Wars are complicated. They involve politics, economics, ego, and power, often more than ideals like freedom or justice. Yet textbooks prefer tidy narratives where America is always the good guy, no questions asked. Take the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. Textbooks often mention it as a border conflict. Reality? Expansionist policy, manifest destiny, a desire for land and resources. Freedom for whom? Not the people already living in Texas and California, many of whom lost property, rights, and even lives. The war was profitable for some and devastating for others. World War I? Textbooks praise the fight for democracy, even while the U.S. initially stayed out. The truth, economic interests, loans, and geopolitical strategy played a huge role. Freedom and justice? Motivating slogans, Convenient for rallies and speeches. Human cost? Tens of thousands dead for reasons that weren't purely moral. World War II? Arguably more justifiable. Fighting fascism seems straightforward. But even there, textbooks often skip the nuance. Internment camps for Japanese Americans, selective propaganda, and strategic decisions that sacrificed some civilians for the greater good. Heroism is highlighted. Complicity, moral compromise, and suffering? Minimized. Vietnam? Textbooks rarely dwell on the massive civilian casualties or the political manipulation behind U.S. involvement. Patriotic soldiers are praised, dissenting voices muted or framed as unpatriotic. The myth, always fight for justice. The reality, sometimes politics, pride, or resources drive conflict far more than virtue. You picture classrooms reciting dates and battles, flags, medals, and generals. It's easier to remember heroes than horrors. Textbooks sanitize death, destruction, and ethical ambiguity into clear-cut stories of American valor. And the myth persists today. History is taught with a moral glow, highlighting righteousness, minimizing mistakes, and compressing complexity. Wars aren't always fought for noble reasons, but textbooks often pretend they are. Comforting, patriotic, and reassuring, all at the cost of truth. So the next time someone claims America fights only for freedom and justice, remember this. Some wars are noble. Some are strategic. Some are catastrophic. Heroes exist, but so do human errors, political calculations, and unintended consequences. Simplifying war into a morality play is convenient, but not accurate. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 14. Take a moment. Let the weight of complexity settle. Because the next myth will show how American history often ignores the human cost of progress. You open your textbook and see factories, smokestacks, and workers looking cheerful, or at least productive. The caption reads something like, "Industrialization brought prosperity to America." You were meant to think everyone had the opportunity to rise, earn, and thrive. Simple. Optimistic. Tidy. Step closer. It's the late 19th century. America is booming with steel, railroads, oil, and textiles. Factories churn. Cities expand. Railroads snake across the country. On paper, industrialization looks like progress. In reality, it's a story of exploitation, inequality, and human suffering. You picture a factory worker. The hours are long, 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day. The machines are loud, dangerous, and unforgiving. Accidents? Frequent. Injuries? Often permanent. Your textbook might mention poor working conditions in a sentence. The reality is grim. It's death, injury, and exhaustion disguised as opportunity. Child labor was common. Children worked in mines, textile mills, and factories. They were small enough to fit under machines, nimble enough to climb dangerous machinery, and cheap enough to replace easily. Education? Optional. Safety? Rare. Textbooks rarely dwell on the tiny hands that powered industrial America or the consequences for their bodies and minds. Meanwhile, wealth is concentrated. Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, industrial giants amass fortunes beyond imagination. The rising tide lifts all boats. Narrative? Not exactly. Most workers remain in poverty, crammed into tenements, facing disease, starvation, and unstable employment. The textbook version prefers shiny success stories, glossing over systemic inequality. And labor movements? Strikes, unions, protests, often violently suppressed. You're meant to remember the heroes of industry, not the workers fighting for basic rights and safety. Textbooks condense months of strikes and bloodshed into a single line. Workers organized to improve conditions. Nice and neat. Very American. Environmental cost? Factories spew smoke, rivers turn black, and cities choke on pollution. Your textbook shows steel mills and railroads as progress, omitting the long-term consequences of industrial greed. Prosperity for some, devastation for the planet and the poor. The myth persists because industrialization is patriotic. It's progress. It's innovation. It's the foundation of modern America. Reality? Unequal, harsh, and often deadly. Success wasn't guaranteed. Opportunity was limited. And suffering was invisible in the classroom narrative. So next time you hear industrialization described as a boon for all, remember this. It wasn't. Some thrived. Many endured hardship. And textbooks prefer a story that makes the country look good. Congrats. You've unlearned myth number 15. Stretch, breathe, and prepare. Because the next myth will show how labor struggles were far messier than the textbooks admit. You open your textbook and see workers holding banners, marching proudly, fists raised in solidarity. The caption reads something like, "Unions fought for workers' rights and improved conditions." You were meant to think, unions are heroic organizations, always righteous, always effective. Simple. Encouraging. Satisfying. Step closer. It's the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Factories are booming. Workers are overworked, underpaid, and often injured. Yes, unions exist. Yes, some strikes achieved better wages or shorter hours. But textbooks rarely tell you how messy, violent, and sometimes corrupt the labor movement really was. Picture a striking worker. The factory doors are locked. Guards stand ready. Strikebreakers are brought in. The situation escalates. Violence erupts. Deaths occur on both sides. Textbooks may condense months of struggle into a single line. Workers organized for better conditions. That's it. No blood, no fear, no human cost. Not all unions were inclusive. Women, immigrants, and people of color were often excluded. The labor movement sometimes reinforced the same inequalities it supposedly opposed. You were meant to admire the movement while ignoring its blind spots. Then there's corruption. Union leaders occasionally exploited members, mismanaged funds, or struck deals with employers that undermined ordinary workers. Your textbook will skip that part. Heroism is far more palatable than messy moral compromise. You picture a steelworker's life, 12-hour shifts, dangerous machinery, occasional strikes, hope mixed with fear. Even victorious strikes didn't always translate to safer working conditions or fair pay. Progress was partial, uneven, and often temporary. Industrialists fought back aggressively. Pinkertons, police, and militia were often used to break strikes. Violence, intimidation, and even assassination attempts were common. The textbook might say, conflict ensued, and leave it at that. Reality? Brutal, bloody, and frighteningly routine. And the myth persists because it's comforting. Unions equals protection. Workers equals heroes. Everything resolves neatly. The truth? Hardly. Union history is full of contradictions, setbacks, and compromises. Success often depended on geography, industry, and the whims of both bosses and labor leaders. So next time you hear that unions always protected workers, remember this. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they failed. Sometimes they made life better, and sometimes they made it more complicated. The textbook version is a story of heroism. The reality is messy, human, and imperfect. Congrats. You've unlearned myth number 16. Take a breath. Because the next myth will show how the American dream often ignores systemic inequality and privilege. You open your textbook and see a cheerful family in front of a suburban home. The caption reads something like, "In America, anyone can achieve the American dream through hard work and determination." Simple. Optimistic. You were meant to think, success is available to anyone who tries hard enough. Step closer. Reality is more complicated. The American dream assumes equal opportunity. It assumes everyone starts from the same line. It assumes systemic barriers don't exist. And none of that is true. Imagine a family in the 1950s. They work tirelessly. They save. They hope. Yet, if they are Black, Latino, Indigenous, or a woman, their chances of homeownership, a quality education, or economic security are drastically limited. Redlining, discriminatory lending, and biased hiring practices weren't myths. They were systemic barriers baked into the dream. Even white families faced obstacles. The unlucky, the sick, the unconnected. Not everyone succeeds. Not everyone even survives economically. Yet textbooks prefer to present a tidy narrative. Opportunity is abundant. Hard work equals reward. It's comforting but false. Education is supposed to be the great equalizer. In theory. In practice, schools are funded by property taxes, meaning the poor attend under-resourced schools while the wealthy benefit from abundant resources. Success becomes a matter of privilege disguised as merit. Textbooks skip this inconvenient truth. It doesn't fit the patriotic storyline. You picture yourself striving for a better life. Maybe you work multiple jobs. Maybe you take on debt for college. Maybe you're careful, disciplined, and moral. And yet, the latter isn't always there. Sometimes it's broken. Sometimes it's missing entirely. Sometimes others have climbed it first simply because they inherited wealth, connections, or advantage. Housing, healthcare, and employment disparities compound the issue. The dream promises mobility, but reality often delivers stagnation. Success stories exist, yes, but they are exceptions highlighted as proof that the system works, rather than examples of human ingenuity overcoming systemic inequity. Textbooks love the American dream because it's neat. It reinforces faith in the system. It suggests fairness, meritocracy, and justice. Reality? Hard work matters, yes, but luck, privilege, and structural inequality matter just as much, sometimes more. So next time someone tells you the American dream is universally attainable, remember this. It's aspirational, not universal. It's a promise often denied by systems and structures that favor some and disadvantage others. Textbooks prefer inspiration over inconvenient truth. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 17. Take a deep breath, because the next myth will show how American immigration history is full of selective storytelling and convenient amnesia. You open your textbook and see a cheerful Ellis Island scene, hopeful faces, families clutching suitcases, waving at the Statue of Liberty. The caption reads something like, "America, the land of opportunity, welcomes all who seek a better life." You're meant to think, the country has always been generous, kind, and fair. Simple. Inspiring. Tidy. Step closer. Reality is messy. America has always had a complicated relationship with immigration, selective, restrictive, and often discriminatory. Imagine arriving in the late 19th century. Ellis Island is crowded. The air is thick with sweat, sea salt, fear, and excitement. Inspectors check names, health, and papers. Some families are turned away, not because of criminality, but because of sickness, poverty, or political belief. Your textbook may mention immigration quotas in passing. The reality? Families separated, dreams delayed, humiliation endured. Even when immigrants are allowed entry, acceptance isn't guaranteed. Irish, Italian, Jewish, and Chinese immigrants faced extreme prejudice. Jobs were low-paying, dangerous, and often denied to those who looked or sounded different. Neighborhoods were segregated by ethnicity, sometimes by law, often by custom. The myth of universal welcome hides decades of harassment, discrimination, and exclusion. Laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882, explicitly banned entire groups. The Immigration Act of 1924 favored Northern and Western Europeans while restricting others. Your textbook may frame these as policy details, but the human cost is staggering. Dreams deferred, families separated, communities stigmatized. You picture a young immigrant child. They arrive full of hope, but face hostility from neighbors, teachers, and employers. Accents mocked. Customs ridiculed. Opportunities limited. The land of opportunity is conditional, available only to certain groups at certain times. And the myth persists today. Textbooks prefer the inspirational story, America welcomes the world. Reality? Acceptance has always been selective, contingent, and often cruel. Stories of hardship, discrimination, and survival are condensed into a few lines, while the Statue of Liberty smiles. So the next time someone tells you that America has always welcomed immigrants with open arms, remember this. It hasn't. Opportunity has been unevenly distributed. Acceptance has been conditional. Textbooks love the narrative of generosity because it's neat, patriotic, and comforting, but it's incomplete. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 18. Sit back, breathe, and prepare. The next myth will show how America's education system often rewrites the story of its own failures. You open your textbook and see a bright, cheerful classroom, children sitting at desks, books open, a teacher smiling at the front. The caption reads something like, "Public schools provide education for all children equally." You're meant to think, regardless of race, background, or neighborhood, every child has the same chance to succeed. Simple, optimistic, comforting. Step closer. Reality is messy. Public education has never been equally accessible. Funding, resources, and opportunities have always varied drastically depending on zip code, race, and economic status. Imagine a school in the early 20th century. Black children attend underfunded, overcrowded schools. Textbooks are old, desks broken, teachers underpaid. Meanwhile, white neighborhoods enjoy well-maintained schools, plentiful books, and well-trained educators. Your textbook may note segregation politely. It rarely conveys the systemic inequality, the sense of second-class status, the daily humiliation. Even after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, integration was slow, resisted, and often incomplete. Separate but equal might be gone legally, but schools remained segregated by housing patterns, funding, and political resistance. Textbooks often leap from the Supreme Court decision to the civil rights movement, skipping decades of struggle and partial victories. Standardized curricula often ignored or minimized the histories of marginalized communities. Native American, African American, Latino, and Asian histories were reduced to footnotes. Textbooks themselves were tools of inequality, shaping what children learned and whose stories were visible. Meanwhile, affluent neighborhoods enjoyed advanced classes, extracurriculars, and college prep opportunities denied elsewhere. You picture a student from a poor, segregated district. They arrive ready to learn, eager, ambitious. Yet their textbooks are outdated, their classes overcrowded, their teachers overworked. Resources promised in theory exist in pockets, not universally. Success depends on circumstances often beyond their control, not hard work or intelligence alone. And the myth persists today. Textbooks still present education as a universal equalizer. It's a comforting story, implying fairness, meritocracy, and opportunity. The truth is more complicated. Systemic inequality, funding disparities, and historical neglect continue to shape student outcomes. So the next time someone tells you public schools provide equal education, remember this. Equality on paper doesn't mean equality in practice. Opportunities have always been unevenly distributed. Textbooks prefer a neat, reassuring story, but reality is far more complex. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 19. Take a breath. Because the next myth will show how American healthcare history often prioritizes profit over people. You open your textbook and see a doctor smiling at a patient in a bright, clean hospital. The caption reads something like, "Healthcare is available to all Americans when they need it." You're meant to think, the system works, everyone gets care, and the sick are treated fairly. Simple, reassuring, tidy. Step closer. Reality is far messy. Healthcare in America has never been equally accessible. Cost, race, geography, and social status determine whether people receive care or receive none at all. Imagine it's the early 20th century. Hospitals exist, yes. Doctors exist. Treatments exist. But for poor people, Black people, Native Americans, and immigrants, access is limited, often non-existent. Segregated hospitals, discriminatory treatment, and lack of insurance mean that healthcare is a privilege, not a right. Textbooks may gloss over this with a sentence about developing healthcare systems, leaving out the human suffering. Even advances in medicine often leave inequality intact. Vaccines, surgeries, and antibiotics save lives, for those who can afford them. For others, these innovations arrive decades later, if at all. Rural communities? Limited hospitals? Fewer specialists, sometimes no doctors for miles. Your textbook will highlight the miracle of medical progress, but rarely who was excluded from it. The mid-20th century saw some improvements: Medicare, Medicaid, public health campaigns. Yet systemic barriers persisted. Discrimination in hospitals, unequal funding, and lack of coverage for marginalized groups continued to limit access. Textbooks love to celebrate policy victories while quietly skipping decades of unmet need. You picture a working-class family in the 1950s. A sick child needs care. Travel to the nearest hospital takes hours. The family scrimps to pay the bill. The treatment is basic. The prognosis uncertain. Meanwhile, wealthier families receive immediate, high-quality care. Inequality isn't theoretical, it's life and death. Even today, healthcare in America remains uneven. Insurance gaps, high costs, and systemic discrimination create barriers for millions. Textbooks often frame healthcare as a national achievement, ignoring ongoing disparities. The narrative comforts, the reality challenges, and the human cost is rarely highlighted. So the next time someone claims American healthcare has always been fair and accessible, remember this. It hasn't. Access has been unequal, exclusion has been systemic, and progress has been partial. Textbooks prefer neat stories of innovation and reform, leaving out the struggle, suffering, and continued inequities. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 20. Take a moment. Let it sink in. The next myth will show how the narrative of American science often hides exploitation and ethical compromise. You open your textbook and see a laboratory filled with white coats, microscopes, and diagrams. The caption reads something like, "American scientists and doctors have always conducted research ethically, advancing knowledge for the good of all." You're meant to think, progress equals morality. Knowledge is inherently noble. Simple. Reassuring. Comfortable. Step closer. Reality is far messy. Science and medicine in America have a long history of ethical compromise, exploitation, and outright abuse. Textbooks often highlight discoveries and inventions while quietly skipping the human cost. Imagine the early 20th century. Tuskegee, 1932 to 1972. Syphilis studies on black men, conducted without consent, without treatment, under the guise of research. Your textbook might mention it in one sentence, decades after the fact, as a lesson learned. The reality, generations of suffering, distrust, and death. Or consider medical experimentation on prisoners, immigrants, and vulnerable populations. Often coerced, sometimes deceptive, rarely safe. Textbooks celebrate medical breakthroughs but rarely acknowledge that some of them were achieved through exploitation. Even outside medicine, science has a murky record. Eugenics programs in the early 1900s influenced policies. Forced sterilizations, immigration restrictions, social engineering. Presented in textbooks as social improvement, but the human cost is staggering. The myth? American science equals progress plus morality. Reality? Progress often came at the expense of the powerless. You picture a young researcher in the lab, notebooks open, ethics forms ignored, ambition high. Advancement for some, suffering for others. The textbooks celebrate discoveries without the messy human stories behind them. And the myth persists today. We love to think of American science as heroic, objective, and ethical. We ignore the failures, abuses, and systemic injustices that accompanied progress. It's comforting. It preserves faith in institutions. But it's incomplete. So the next time someone claims American science and medicine have always been ethical, remember this. They haven't. Human ambition, bias, and systemic inequality have shaped research as much as curiosity and discovery. Textbooks prefer heroes, discoveries, and milestones, not the ethical compromises, exploitation, or harm inflicted along the way. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 21. Take a deep breath. Because the next myth will show how American foreign policy is often presented as altruistic, while masking strategic and economic interests. You open your textbook and see flags waving over foreign capitals, soldiers shaking hands with smiling locals, and captions praising the spread of liberty. The message is clear. America fights for freedom and democracy around the world. You're meant to think every intervention, every war, every treaty is a moral endeavor. Simple. Reassuring. Step closer. Reality is messy. American foreign policy has often been driven by self-interest, economics, and strategic advantage, not altruism. Textbooks prefer tidy narratives where America is the hero, glossing over inconvenient details. Take the early 20th century. Interventions in Latin America, Nicaragua, Honduras, Haiti are often described as stabilizing or protecting investments. Local governments were overthrown. Economies were controlled. Resistance was suppressed. Freedom? For the locals, it was more like a footnote. Or consider the Cold War. The textbook glosses over coups in Iran, Guatemala, and elsewhere as necessary measures to stop communism. Reality: America often installed or supported authoritarian regimes to protect economic or strategic interests, all while claiming to defend democracy. Textbooks rarely dwell on the human cost: violence, oppression, and displacement. Even in wars framed as noble, like World War II, foreign policy decisions were complicated. Internment of Japanese Americans, selective aid, and political calculations show that morality was not always the guiding principle. Textbooks highlight victory and liberation, not compromise, racism, or strategic convenience. You picture a classroom map, arrows indicating interventions, military bases, treaties, and conflicts. It's neat, logical, and morally uplifting. Reality? Decisions made in Washington often had devastating consequences abroad: coups, starvation, puppet governments, and long-term instability. And the myth persists today. We like to think of America as the global moral authority. We ignore instances where self-interest, corporate gain, or geopolitical strategy were the real motivators. Textbooks love hero narratives. They hate nuance, moral ambiguity, and inconvenient truths. So the next time someone claims American foreign policy always promotes freedom and democracy, remember this: it doesn't. Sometimes it does, sometimes it pretends to, and sometimes it acts in pursuit of power, resources, or influence. Textbooks prefer the tidy story of noble intentions, even when reality is far less flattering. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 22. Take a moment to let it sink in, because the next myth will reveal how the American criminal justice system has been presented as fair, while historically it often reinforced inequality. You open your textbook and see a courthouse, a gavel, scales of justice, a judge presiding solemnly. The caption reads something like, "The American justice system guarantees fairness for all citizens." You're meant to think, equality under the law is a given, and justice is blind. Simple. Reassuring. Comforting. Step closer. Reality is far messy. The justice system has long been a reflection of social hierarchies, bias, and systemic inequality, not a neutral arbiter of fairness. Textbooks prefer neat examples of landmark cases and constitutional principles, leaving the messy, human stories out. Imagine it's the post-Reconstruction South. Black citizens technically have rights, but courts, police, and juries are overwhelmingly white. Laws are enforced selectively. Violence against black communities often goes unpunished. The textbook might note the 14th Amendment, but it rarely conveys how fragile its protections were in practice. Even beyond race, wealth and social status determine outcomes. A wealthy defendant can afford high-powered lawyers, while a poor defendant faces underfunded public defenders or none at all. Textbooks love to celebrate Supreme Court decisions, but rarely discuss how limited access to justice affects ordinary people. You picture a person accused of a minor crime. Arrested, jailed, awaiting trial. Weeks, months, maybe years pass. Legal complexity and systemic inefficiency mean that fairness is more an ideal than a reality. Meanwhile, the rich or well-connected navigate the system with relative ease. And let's not forget sentencing disparities. For decades, laws have been applied unevenly: crack versus powder cocaine, mandatory minimums, and biased policing practices disproportionately affect marginalized communities. The textbooks condense all of this into laws exist to maintain order, leaving out injustice, bias, and inequality. Violence, incarceration, and social control are also historical tools of power. From slave patrols to Jim Crow policing to modern mass incarceration, the system has often maintained social hierarchies rather than fairness. Textbooks prefer the heroic story of reform and rights, not the systemic oppression that persists alongside it. You might think the system is blind. It isn't. It sees wealth, race, gender, and power, and it reacts accordingly. Textbooks often obscure this truth for the sake of patriotic narratives and simplicity. So the next time someone claims the American criminal justice system has always been fair and impartial, remember this. It hasn't. Bias, inequality, and selective enforcement are baked into its history. Textbooks prefer the reassuring myth over inconvenient reality. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 23. Take a moment to let it sink in, because the next myth will reveal how American policing has historically prioritized control over community. You open your textbook and see uniformed officers smiling, shaking hands with children, patrolling peaceful streets. The caption reads something like, "Police protect and serve all communities fairly." You're meant to think, justice and safety are evenly distributed, impartial, reliable. Simple. Comforting. Step closer. Reality is more complicated. Policing in America has historically prioritized control over protection, often reinforcing social hierarchies rather than community safety. Textbooks prefer hero stories and community outreach images, leaving systemic issues in the shadows. Imagine it's the 19th century. Slave patrols enforce laws on black communities in the South, ensuring enslaved people remain subjugated. Post-Civil War, police and sheriffs often uphold Jim Crow laws, suppressing civil rights rather than protecting citizens equally. Textbooks might label this historical enforcement, glossing over the violence and oppression involved. Even in northern cities, policing often reinforced class and racial hierarchies. Immigrant neighborhoods face heavy surveillance, raids, and harsh punishments, while affluent areas enjoy more leniency. The idea of impartial protection is, at best, aspirational. You picture a modern scenario. A black family lives in an over-policed neighborhood. Minor infractions trigger harsh responses. Meanwhile, wealthier, whiter neighborhoods experience minimal intervention for similar behavior. Textbooks condense this into a few lines about law enforcement evolution, omitting systemic bias and disproportionate impact. Policing has often intersected with politics, economics, and control. From labor strikes to civil rights protests, law enforcement has frequently acted to maintain social order favorable to the powerful. Public safety, as presented in textbooks, is often secondary to power preservation. You might imagine policing as inherently noble. In some instances, yes, individual officers act heroically. But the system as a whole has historically reinforced inequality, sometimes violently. Textbooks prefer inspiring anecdotes over structural critique, leaving you with a tidy, incomplete narrative. So the next time someone claims American policing has always protected communities equally, remember this. It hasn't. Protection has been uneven. Bias, violence, and social control have long been baked into the system. Textbooks prefer comforting myths over inconvenient truths. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 24. Take a breath, because the next myth will reveal how American housing history has long promoted inequality while claiming opportunity. You open your textbook and see a suburban neighborhood, white picket fences, manicured lawns, kids playing in the yard. The caption reads something like, "Homeownership is the American right and available to all who work hard." You're meant to think anyone can buy a home, build equity, and achieve stability. Simple. Comforting. Optimistic. Step closer. Reality is much messy. Housing and homeownership in America have been highly segregated, discriminatory, and unequal, despite what textbooks suggest. Opportunities to own a home have historically been available primarily to white Americans. Imagine the mid-20th century. Government-backed loans, the backbone of the post-war housing boom, are offered almost exclusively to white families. Redlining maps define which neighborhoods are desirable and which are hazardous. Minority families are systematically denied loans, access to housing, or insurance. Your textbook may mention housing policies, but it rarely conveys the systemic exclusion or generational consequences. You picture a black family in the 1950s. They save for years, but lenders refuse to provide a mortgage. Neighborhoods are off-limits, local ordinances restrict where they can live, and informal discrimination ensures they remain in underfunded, crowded areas. Meanwhile, white families accumulate wealth through homeownership, passing it down for generations. Even beyond race, social and economic status heavily influenced access. Lower-income families faced barriers regardless of background: insufficient credit, discriminatory practices, and limited affordable housing. Textbooks focus on suburban growth and the American dream, neighborhoods, leaving the story of inequality largely untold. You imagine the long-term impact. Generational wealth is concentrated in families with access to good housing and mortgages. Families denied these opportunities face persistent economic disadvantages. The myth of universal access hides decades of structural discrimination and unequal opportunity. Policies like urban renewal often worsened inequality. Entire minority neighborhoods were razed, displacing communities and destroying wealth while new, affluent neighborhoods flourished. Textbooks might briefly mention urban development, but rarely highlight the social cost. So the next time someone tells you housing and homeownership have always been accessible to all Americans, remember this: they haven't. Opportunity has been selectively granted. Inequality, discrimination, and systemic barriers have shaped who can own a home and build wealth. Textbooks prefer tidy success stories, white picket fences and growing suburbs, over uncomfortable truths. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 25. Take a breath, because the next myth will reveal how the American welfare system often failed the people it claimed to help. You open your textbook and see smiling families receiving aid, cheerful social workers, and captions like, "Government programs provide support to all in need." You're meant to think, help is available, fair, and effective. Simple. Reassuring. Optimistic. Step closer. Reality is far messy. Social welfare in America has historically been selective, stigmatized, and limited in scope. Textbooks often present programs as universal solutions while ignoring who actually benefited and who was left out. Imagine the Great Depression. The New Deal creates programs to aid struggling families, farmers, and unemployed workers. On paper, everyone gets help. In reality, Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities often face exclusion. Relief programs are administered locally, and discriminatory practices decide who receives aid and who doesn't. You picture a Black family applying for relief in the 1930s. They are turned away from programs that are technically available to everyone. Local administrators impose bias. Policies prioritize white citizens. Meanwhile, white families receive assistance, unemployment relief, and housing support. Textbooks may celebrate the New Deal as a national victory while glossing over these inequities. Even after reforms, welfare programs continue to face issues. Aid is stigmatized. Recipients are portrayed as lazy or undeserving. Eligibility rules disproportionately exclude people of color, single mothers, and rural families. Textbooks prefer to show safety nets as inherently just, leaving out the social and systemic barriers to access. You imagine a low-income single parent today. Applying for assistance requires hours of paperwork, proof, and bureaucracy. Funds are often insufficient or delayed. Access is conditional, frustrating, and frequently inadequate. The myth of universal help masks the reality. Welfare has never truly been universal. Political narratives have often undermined welfare programs. Textbooks may note reforms, expansions, or legislation, but rarely dwell on the racialized and class-based attacks that shaped public perception. Helping everyone is a comforting story, but reality reveals selective aid and social control disguised as support. And the myth persists. Many Americans still believe social programs are equally effective for all citizens. Textbooks reinforce this by showing programs in isolation, success stories, cheerful families, and program logos. The ongoing gaps, discrimination, and administrative barriers are conveniently omitted. So the next time someone claims social welfare programs have always helped all Americans effectively, remember this. They haven't. Aid has been selective, conditional, and often insufficient. Textbooks prefer tidy narratives and inspiring stories over inconvenient, unequal realities. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 26. Take a deep breath, because the next myth will reveal how American energy and environmental history often prioritizes profit over sustainability and safety. You open your textbook and see national parks, clean rivers, and people hiking through pristine forests. The caption reads something like, "America has long valued environmental conservation and protection." You're meant to think, nature is sacred, industry is balanced, and progress coexists harmoniously with the environment. Simple. Reassuring. Step closer. Reality is far messy. American history is full of environmental exploitation, often driven by profit, industrial expansion, and political convenience. Textbooks highlight the few conservation victories while ignoring centuries of ecological harm. Imagine the 19th century. Forests cleared for railroads, farms, and timber. Rivers dammed, wetlands drained. Mining operations dig deep, polluting water and soil. Textbooks mention westward expansion, industry, and resource use, but rarely dwell on the ecological devastation that accompanied it. You picture a river near a growing industrial town. Smokestacks dump chemicals, dead fish float on the surface, residents cough from polluted air. Companies profit. Communities suffer. Textbooks show the growth and prosperity, skipping the environmental and human costs. Even early conservation efforts were selective. National parks are celebrated as victories, yet they often displaced indigenous communities, ignoring the people who had lived in harmony with the land for centuries. Environmental protection wasn't always about preserving nature for its own sake. Sometimes it was about tourism, aesthetics, or controlling land for elite benefit. Fast forward to the 20th century. Industrial accidents, chemical dumping, and urban pollution wreak havoc on ecosystems. Love Canal, Cuyahoga River fires, and smog-filled cities are often condensed in textbooks into minor cautionary notes. Meanwhile, corporations and government policies frequently prioritize profit over environmental safety. You picture workers and communities living near toxic sites. Health consequences? Severe. Textbooks may include the story of regulation or cleanup, but rarely convey years of suffering and negligence. Progress is celebrated. Harm is footnoted. And the myth persists today. Americans are taught to feel proud of conservation milestones while often ignoring decades of environmental degradation and exploitation. Textbooks simplify a complex balance of industry, policy, and human impact into neat images of national parks and green legislation. So the next time someone claims America has always prioritized environmental protection over profit, remember this. It hasn't. Profit, industry, and policy have often outweighed preservation. Textbooks prefer inspiring stories of parks and legislation over inconvenient realities of environmental harm and human cost. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 27. Take a deep breath, because the next myth will reveal how American media has shaped public perception, often masking bias and selective storytelling. You open your textbook and see a newsroom, anchors at desks, reporters holding microphones, cameras rolling. The caption reads something like, "American media provides accurate, unbiased information to all citizens." You're meant to think, newspapers, television, and now digital outlets tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Simple. Reassuring. Comforting. Step closer. Reality is far more complicated. American media has always been shaped by bias, corporate interests, and political influence. Textbooks may mention freedom of the press, but rarely discuss the ways information is filtered, framed, and sometimes distorted. Imagine the late 19th century. Newspapers sell stories to attract readers. Yellow journalism flourishes, sensationalized headlines, exaggerated scandals, and even outright lies to boost circulation. Textbooks might note the term yellow journalism, but skip the social impact. Public opinion shaped, wars sensationalized, communities misled. You picture a headline screaming about political corruption or foreign threat. Readers consume it as truth. The reality? Facts twisted, context ignored, nuance absent. The press shapes perception, not necessarily reality. Fast forward to the 20th century. Media consolidates under a few corporations. Economic interests influence coverage. Political leanings color reporting. Textbooks may highlight the rise of television news or investigative journalism, but rarely discuss selective storytelling, editorial bias, or censorship. Even objective reporting has limitations. Which stories get told? Which voices are amplified? Which are ignored? Minorities, dissenting opinions, and controversial truths are often marginalized. Textbooks focus on the heroic journalist exposing corruption, not on the millions of untold stories. You imagine a modern media landscape. Endless channels, social media, viral headlines. Information overload creates the illusion of comprehensiveness. Yet framing, algorithmic bias, and selective coverage shape perception more than raw facts. Textbooks still present media as an unbiased check on power, comforting but misleading. And the myth persists. Citizens are taught to trust media as a neutral mirror of reality. The reality? Media is both powerful and partial, capable of informing and misleading simultaneously. Textbooks prefer neat narratives about journalists and freedom of the press, leaving out the gray areas, corporate influence, and human bias. So the next time someone claims American media has always reported the full, unbiased truth, remember this. It hasn't. Bias, selective reporting, and corporate or political influence have shaped narratives throughout history. Textbooks prefer comfort and clarity over messy, inconvenient reality. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 28. Take a moment to breathe. Because the next myth will reveal how American elections are often portrayed as purely democratic while systemic barriers shape voter access. You open your textbook and see a line of voters, flags waving, a ballot being cast. The caption reads something like, "Every American has equal access to voting, and elections are conducted fairly." You're meant to think, democracy works perfectly, one person, one vote, all voices heard. Simple. Comforting. Tidy. Step closer. Reality is far messy. American elections have always been shaped by restrictions, suppression, and inequality, even while textbooks celebrate milestones like universal suffrage. Imagine the 19th century. Women are barred from voting. Black men may technically have the right to vote after Reconstruction, but intimidation, literacy tests, poll taxes, and outright violence prevent them from participating. Textbooks may note the 15th Amendment, but rarely convey how fragile and limited its protections were in practice. You picture a citizen attempting to vote. Long lines, aggressive officials, confusing paperwork. The outcome isn't determined by intent or merit. It's shaped by law, prejudice, and access. Meanwhile, privileged groups encounter none of these obstacles. Textbooks focus on constitutional amendments, glossing over the practical barriers millions faced. Even after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, suppression tactics evolve. Gerrymandering, voter ID laws, and polling location closures disproportionately affect marginalized communities. Textbooks often celebrate the act's passage but skip the decades of struggle and ongoing challenges that continue today. You imagine modern elections. High-tech systems, media coverage, endless debates. Access is uneven. Rural voters travel miles to vote. Some work multiple jobs, others face bureaucratic hurdles. The narrative of a fully functioning democracy is comforting, but incomplete. Elections are influenced by money, media, and policy. Corporate donations, lobbying, and partisan gerrymandering shape outcomes as much as ballots. Textbooks like to highlight historical firsts, first women voters, first black voters, while omitting systemic inequalities that persist. And the myth persists. Citizens are taught to believe democracy in America is flawless and universally accessible. Reality? Voting access has always been contested, conditional, and unequal. Textbooks prefer milestones over messiness, symbolism over systemic truth. So the next time someone claims American elections have always been fair and fully accessible, remember this. They haven't. Access has been uneven, suppression persistent, and influence concentrated. Textbooks prefer neat stories of progress over inconvenient realities. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 29. Take a deep breath, because the final myth will reveal how American history often sanitizes the story of wealth, labor, and inequality under the guise of progress. You open your textbook and see a montage of skyscrapers, factories, bustling cities, and smiling families. The caption reads something like, "American progress has improved the lives of all citizens, lifting everyone to prosperity." You're meant to think, innovation, industry, and policy have created widespread opportunity. Simple, comforting, tidy. Step closer. Reality is far messy. Progress has always been uneven, often benefiting the wealthy, powerful, and well-connected while leaving others behind. Textbooks love growth stories, the rise of America, narrative, and rarely highlight who pays the cost. Imagine the Industrial Revolution. Factories hum. Railroads connect coasts. Cities grow. Some people thrive. Industrialists amass unimaginable wealth. Others toil 12-hour days in dangerous conditions, living in crowded, unsanitary tenements. Textbooks show steel mills and railroads as symbols of advancement, leaving the human cost off the page. You picture a low-income immigrant family. They work, save, and hope. Opportunities exist in theory, but systemic barriers limit mobility. Generational wealth? Mostly inaccessible. Textbooks prefer the inspiring story of the self-made man, ignoring structural inequality and social disadvantage. Even 20th century progress, suburban expansion, education reform, technological innovation, is unevenly distributed. Redlining, segregated schools, unequal healthcare, and labor exploitation mean that not everyone benefits equally. Textbooks celebrate growth and innovation while minimizing who is excluded or harmed. Environmental progress? Electricity, highways, and industry are lauded. But communities near factories, mines, or polluted rivers pay a heavy cost. Textbooks rarely mention the long-term consequences for health, safety, and environmental justice. You picture modern America. Tech giants, corporate success, global influence, visible prosperity. Meanwhile, marginalized communities struggle with debt, unemployment, and limited access to opportunity. Progress is real, but distributed unevenly, often reinforcing existing inequalities. And the myth persists. Textbooks present progress as linear, universal, and morally virtuous. Reality? Advancement has winners and losers. Opportunities are conditional. Wealth accumulates for some while barriers persist for others. So the next time someone claims American progress has benefited everyone equally, remember this. It hasn't. Prosperity has always been selective, shaped by wealth, race, class, and privilege. Textbooks prefer neat, inspiring stories, skyscrapers, inventions, and booming cities over inconvenient truths about inequality, exclusion, and human cost. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 30. Take a deep breath. Lean back. Reflect. Because the story of America is not a tidy list of victories. It's a complex, uneven, and deeply human tale, full of ambition, error, progress, and inequity. You open your textbook and see a serene painting, Native Americans bowing politely to settlers, peacefully retreating into the forests. The caption reads something like, Native Americans gradually gave way to European settlers. You're meant to think, they ceded land, culture, and power voluntarily, and life moved on naturally. Simple. Comforting. Step closer. Reality is far messy. Native Americans were forcibly removed, massacred, and displaced over centuries. Policies like the Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, and countless military campaigns caused immense suffering and death. Textbooks often describe this as migration or relocation, downplaying the violence and coercion involved. Imagine a Cherokee family in the 1830s. Soldiers arrive. Homes burned or seized. Thousands are marched hundreds of miles west, without adequate food, shelter, or medicine. Disease, starvation, and exposure claim thousands of lives. Textbooks may mention the Trail of Tears in one line, but rarely convey the scale of human suffering. Even before formal policies, epidemics brought by settlers decimated populations, often intentionally. Smallpox blankets, forced labor, and violent suppression were everyday realities. Textbooks prefer the narrative of civilization advancing, rather than detailing genocide, displacement, and cultural destruction. You picture the ongoing struggle, communities resisting erasure, traditions maintained secretly, stories passed quietly. History is not tidy. Native Americans did not vanish voluntarily, they were pushed to the margins while textbooks sanitized the process. And the myth persists. Americans are taught that native populations disappeared, leaving room for settlement. Reality? Survival despite systemic violence. Textbooks prefer comfort over truth. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 31. Take a deep breath. Because the next myth will show how America's war history is often glorified while omitting moral ambiguity and civilian suffering. You open your textbook and see soldiers marching proudly, flags waving, and captions like, "America fights for freedom and justice." You're meant to think, every war is noble, every battle necessary, every cause righteous. Simple. Comforting. Tidy. Step closer. Reality is far messy. American wars are often motivated by a mix of ideology, economics, and strategic interests, not purely morality. Textbooks glorify battles, heroes, and victories while minimizing civilian suffering, questionable motives, and unintended consequences. Imagine a village in Vietnam during the 1960s. Explosions tear through the landscape. Families flee, crops burn, and innocents die. Your textbook might highlight a major battle or military tactic, but rarely the human cost. The war is framed as heroic, the devastation footnoted. Even wars often celebrated for defending democracy, like World War II, had moral gray areas. Internment camps, strategic bombing of civilian areas, and political compromises reveal complexity rarely acknowledged. Textbooks prefer the tidy story: good guys, bad guys, victory, peace. Reality? Shades of gray, often uncomfortable. You picture the American Revolutionary War. Textbooks present patriots fighting for liberty. But what about loyalists, native communities, and enslaved people? Their lives were upended, often violently, by a conflict framed as heroic and righteous. Textbooks rarely address who truly suffered for the cause. Even the language of war is sanitized. Collateral damage replaces death and destruction. Liberation replaces occupation. Textbooks love concise narratives. Messy moral ambiguity doesn't fit neatly on a page. You picture a soldier riding home. They fight, obey orders, and witness horrors. The textbooks show medals, speeches, and memorials. They rarely show the nightmares, trauma, and moral compromise experienced daily. And the myth persists. Americans are taught wars are always justified, morally clear, and necessary. Reality? Often morally complex, strategically motivated, and devastating for civilians. Textbooks prefer clarity and heroism over nuance and suffering. So the next time someone claims American wars have always been just and morally clear, remember this. They haven't. Textbooks love the tidy story of valor, but reality is chaotic, tragic, and morally complex. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 32. Take a deep breath. Because the next myth will show how American consumerism is often presented as progress while masking exploitation. You open your textbook and see bustling department stores, shiny advertisements, and smiling shoppers with bags in hand. The caption reads something like, The rise of American consumerism improved everyone's standard of living. You're meant to think economic growth, new products, and buying power are equally available to all. Simple, comforting, tidy. Step closer. Reality is far messy. Consumerism has historically benefited the wealthy, prioritized profit over labor rights, and often relied on exploitation. Textbooks love stories of invention, mass production, and advertising brilliance, rarely the human cost behind the goods. Imagine a factory in the early 20th century. Workers operate dangerous machinery for long hours. Child labor is common. Wages are minimal. The products they create, toys, clothing, household goods, are sold at a profit to middle and upper-class families. Textbooks focus on economic expansion, ignoring the hands that made it possible. Even the democratization of products wasn't equal. Automobiles, radios, and televisions initially required disposable income many didn't have. Minority communities and low-income families often had limited access to these symbols of modern living. Textbooks highlight innovation and affordability without mentioning who was excluded. You picture an early 20th century consumer. The store shelves gleam. Advertising promises happiness, status, and progress. But behind the gleam, long hours, unsafe working conditions, low wages, and exploitation. Textbooks prefer the shiny, not the grimy reality. Consumerism also reshaped neighborhoods and labor markets. Chain stores and monopolies drove small businesses out of business. Workers migrated to cities, often living in overcrowded, substandard housing. The narrative of progress and prosperity overlooks displacement and inequality. Even today, globalization continues the pattern. Cheap goods often come from laborers in dangerous, underpaid conditions abroad. Textbooks rarely address international exploitation in stories of American prosperity. And the myth persists. We are taught to equate consumption with progress and fairness. Reality? Prosperity is selective, labor conditions unequal, and wealth concentrated. Textbooks prefer neat, optimistic narratives over inconvenient truths about exploitation and inequality. So the next time someone claims American consumerism has always benefited everyone fairly, remember this. It hasn't. The myth of equal opportunity in consumption masks a history of labor exploitation, unequal access, and profit-driven inequality. Textbooks favor shiny products over messy human reality. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 33. Take a breath. Because the next myth will reveal how American technological progress is often presented as universally empowering, while leaving many behind. You open your textbook and see a montage: computers, factories, and satellites orbiting Earth. The caption reads something like, "American innovation has improved life for all citizens equally." You're meant to think, every new invention, every technological breakthrough raises the standard of living for everyone. Simple, comforting, tidy. Step closer. Reality is far messy. Technological progress often benefits the wealthy, concentrates power, and leaves marginalized communities behind. Textbooks love stories of Silicon Valley, Edison, and the space race, rarely the inequities created along the way. Imagine a factory adopting automation in the mid-20th century. Production skyrockets. Profits increase. Workers lose jobs, wages stagnate, communities struggle to adapt. Textbooks celebrate efficiency, innovation, and national growth. The human cost? Footnoted or invisible. Even modern technology reflects inequality. Access to computers, high-speed internet, and advanced medical technology is uneven. Rural areas, low-income neighborhoods, and marginalized communities often lag behind. Textbooks highlight breakthroughs as universally beneficial while ignoring who is excluded. You picture a student in a low-income school. No computers, outdated textbooks, unreliable internet. Meanwhile, wealthier students access online resources, coding programs, and advanced STEM education. Innovation exists, yes, but access is far from universal. Technological progress also reshapes power. Surveillance tools, data collection, and algorithmic bias concentrate control for governments and corporations. Textbooks focus on invention, not control, surveillance, or ethical consequences. You might imagine a rural hospital receiving a new MRI machine. It sits unused for months, no trained staff, no funding, no electricity. Progress exists on paper, reality lags far behind. Textbooks prefer bright images and headlines over practical limitations and systemic inequities. And the myth persists. We are taught that innovation automatically improves lives for everyone. Reality? Benefits are selective, unequal, and sometimes reinforce existing inequalities. Textbooks favor awe-inspiring inventions over messy, uneven human impact. So the next time someone claims American technological progress has benefited everyone equally, remember this. It hasn't. Advances often empower the privileged while leaving others behind. Textbooks prefer dazzling breakthroughs over inconvenient truths about inequity. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 34. Take a deep breath, because the next myth will show how American taxation is often presented as fair, while systematically favoring the wealthy. You open your textbook and see a smiling family filing forms, a neat tax office, and a caption: "Taxes are collected fairly to fund services for all citizens." You're meant to think everyone contributes their share, everyone benefits, and the system is impartial. Simple. Comforting. Tidy. Step closer. Reality is far messy. Taxes in America have historically favored the wealthy, incentivized certain behaviors, and left marginalized communities paying disproportionately. Textbooks love stories of federal revenue, public programs, and policy milestones, rarely the ways the system benefits some at the expense of others. Imagine the early 20th century. Corporate tax loopholes, low rates on the rich, and complex deductions allow industrialists to retain enormous wealth. Meanwhile, ordinary workers face payroll taxes and minimal benefits. Textbooks highlight rates and reforms but rarely illustrate how inequality persists under the guise of fairness. You picture a middle-class worker today. They dutifully file forms, pay taxes on wages, and receive minimal deductions. A wealthy CEO? Multiple offshore accounts, legal loopholes, and tax shelters reduce their effective rate dramatically. Textbooks prefer to talk about national revenue, deficit, or progressive taxation without showing the lived reality. Even historically fair reforms, like higher top rates in the mid-20th century, benefited elites who could exploit loopholes, while working-class citizens still felt the burden. Property taxes, sales taxes, and local levies disproportionately affect the poor. Textbooks rarely note that tax structures reflect and reinforce social hierarchies. You might imagine a small business owner navigating deductions, credits, and regulations. Complexity favors those with accountants, attorneys, and financial teams. The average person? Confusion, penalties, and occasionally audits. Textbooks love neat percentages. They skip human frustration. And the myth persists. We are taught that taxation is neutral, fair, and evenly distributed. Reality? Wealthy individuals and corporations frequently wield the system to consolidate advantage, while others shoulder the burden. Textbooks prefer reassuring narratives over messy, inconvenient realities of inequality. So the next time someone claims American taxes have always been fair and equitable, remember this. They haven't. Wealth, influence, and complexity shape who pays, who benefits, and who is left behind. Textbooks favor neat numbers over human experience. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 35. Take a breath, because the next myth will reveal how American philanthropy is often presented as altruistic while masking inequality and influence. You open your textbook and see wealthy benefactors smiling, hospitals funded, schools built, and a caption: "American philanthropy supports society and helps those in need." You're meant to think, rich people give generously to help everyone, selflessly. Simple. Comforting. Step closer. Reality is far messy. Philanthropy often serves the interests of the wealthy, reinforces social hierarchies, and can be more about influence than altruism. Textbooks love inspiring stories of foundations, donations, and endowments, rarely the motivations behind the giving. Imagine a Gilded Age magnate donating a library. It benefits the public, yes, but it also creates prestige, influence, and political leverage. Textbooks celebrate the gift and ignore the power dynamics, the labor exploited to amass the fortune, and the limited reach of such aid. Even today, major donations often come with strings attached. Naming rights, tax breaks, and policy influence shape the impact of philanthropy. Textbooks highlight the positive outcomes, a new school, a research grant, but rarely the inequalities perpetuated behind the scenes. You picture a low-income community hoping for support. They may receive grants or programs, but often conditions, restrictions, or selective application limit true access. Meanwhile, wealthy donors dictate priorities, deciding which problems are worthy of attention. Textbooks love the story of generosity. They skip questions of fairness, equity, and systemic power. Philanthropy also functions as social control. Hospitals, universities, and cultural institutions shaped by private donations often reflect the donor's values and interests, not the needs of the communities they serve. Textbooks portray benevolence. Reality includes influence, leverage, and occasionally self-interest disguised as charity. You might imagine a modern foundation giving millions to educational technology. The school gains new resources. The donor gains publicity, influence over curriculum, and a tax break. Textbooks highlight the win-win story, ignoring the asymmetry and underlying motivations. And the myth persists. We are taught to admire philanthropy as inherently selfless. Reality? Wealth and power often guide giving more than altruism, and inequality is rarely challenged through charitable acts. Textbooks prefer the heartwarming story over the inconvenient truth of systemic imbalance. So the next time someone claims American philanthropy has always been purely altruistic, remember this. It hasn't. Generosity is often selective, strategic, and intertwined with influence and power. Textbooks favor inspiring narratives over messy human and structural realities. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 36. Take a deep breath, because the next myth will reveal how American labor markets are often portrayed as meritocratic while systemic inequality skews opportunity. You open your textbook and see workers climbing ladders, shaking hands with bosses, and captions like, "Hard work and talent are always rewarded in America." You're meant to think, opportunity is equal, effort determines success, and merit alone defines outcomes. Simple. Comforting. Tidy. Step closer. Reality is far messy. Labor markets have long been shaped by race, gender, class, and social networks. Textbooks love success stories of self-made individuals, leaving structural inequality off the page. Imagine a young worker in the 1950s. They arrive at a factory, eager to climb the ladder. White male employees are promoted quickly. Women and people of color face ceilings, quotas, or outright exclusion. Textbooks may mention equal opportunity, but ignore everyday discrimination and systemic barriers. Even today, meritocracy is often a myth. Access to education, professional networks, internships, and mentorship is unevenly distributed. Hard work helps, but structural privilege often determines the starting line, and sometimes the finish line. Textbooks highlight individual achievement while downplaying the invisible ladders others never get. You picture someone from a low-income background trying to enter a high-paying field. They may have talent, ambition, and drive. But unpaid internships, networking events, and educational costs limit opportunity. Meanwhile, someone born into privilege enters with connections and resources, often celebrated as self-made. Labor markets also reflect historical discrimination. Segregation, redlining, and exclusionary hiring practices have long-lasting effects. Textbooks may note reforms like the Civil Rights Act or affirmative action, but rarely convey decades of persistent disadvantage. You might imagine a CEO praising their merit-based rise. It's true they worked hard, but they also benefit from a system shaped to favor certain social groups. Textbooks love this tidy narrative of individual effort, ignoring the invisible advantages others lack. And the myth persists. Americans are taught that effort alone determines success. Reality? Opportunity is uneven, outcomes reflect privilege, and merit often intersects with inequality. Textbooks prefer inspiring stories over inconvenient structural truths. So the next time someone claims American labor markets have always rewarded merit, not privilege, remember this. They haven't. Structural inequality, bias, and inherited advantage have long skewed opportunity. Textbooks favor clean success stories over messy, human reality. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 37. Take a deep breath. Because the next myth will reveal how American foreign aid is often presented as generosity while serving strategic self-interest. You open your textbook and see smiling children receiving food, doctors treating patients, and captions like, "America helps countries in need through generous foreign aid." You're meant to think, all aid is given selflessly to improve lives, with no ulterior motive. Simple. Comforting. Tidy. Step closer. Reality is far messy. Foreign aid is often driven by strategic, economic, and political interests rather than pure humanitarianism. Textbooks love images of relief and development projects, rarely explaining the hidden agendas behind the generosity. Imagine a developing country in the Cold War era. Aid flows in, yes, but often tied to U.S. military alliances, access to resources, or alignment with political interests. Textbooks might describe aid programs as unambiguously positive, leaving out the strategic manipulation or conditions imposed. You picture a local community receiving infrastructure support. Bridges are built, schools funded, technically helpful. But decisions are made by foreign donors, not locals. Textbooks focus on outcomes, not power dynamics. The narrative of generosity obscures inequality, coercion, and influence. Even aid framed as humanitarian often carries strings. Loans create debt dependency. Programs can favor elites or governments friendly to U.S. interests rather than the most vulnerable populations. Textbooks highlight statistics and success stories, leaving out the social, political, and economic costs. You might imagine a famine relief program. Food arrives, yes, but distribution is controlled, access restricted, and benefits skewed toward politically strategic regions. Textbooks show trucks of aid and grateful villagers, ignoring the manipulation and partiality. And the myth persists. Americans are taught that foreign aid is purely altruistic. Reality? Aid is a complex mix of generosity, strategic influence, and national interest. Textbooks prefer neat narratives over messy realities of power, inequality, and politics. So the next time someone claims American foreign aid has always been purely altruistic, remember this. It hasn't. Generosity is often intertwined with influence and self-interest. Textbooks favor heartwarming stories over inconvenient global truths. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 38. Take a deep breath. Because the next myth will reveal how American history often portrays immigration policy as fair while selectively restricting certain groups. You open your textbook and see a line of hopeful immigrants at a port, officials smiling, and captions like, "America welcomes immigrants from all backgrounds equally." You're meant to think, immigration has always been accessible, fair, and impartial. Simple. Comforting. Tidy. Step closer. Reality is far messy. American immigration policy has long been selective, exclusionary, and shaped by race, nationality, and class. Textbooks love inspirational stories of Ellis Island, cultural diversity, and melting pot rhetoric, rarely mentioning systemic barriers. Imagine the early 20th century. Immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe face quotas, scrutiny, and suspicion. Asian immigrants are explicitly barred by law. Textbooks might highlight Ellis Island welcomed millions, but gloss over who was turned away or detained indefinitely. You picture a Chinese family trying to enter the U.S. in 1882. The Chinese Exclusion Act prevents them from citizenship and severely limits immigration. Families separated, communities restricted. Textbooks may describe legislation as neutral policy, skipping the prejudice and human suffering behind it. Even later reforms, like the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, addressed some inequities but did not erase systemic barriers. Language, wealth, and political considerations still limited access. Textbooks celebrate diversity gains without emphasizing the decades of exclusion that shaped American society. You might imagine a refugee today. They face complex applications, long delays, and uncertain legal processes. Meanwhile, wealthy, well-connected applicants often navigate the system more easily. Textbooks portray immigration as universally fair, ignoring these structural disparities. Immigration policy also reflects shifting economic and geopolitical priorities. Workers from certain countries are encouraged when labor is needed, excluded when convenient. Textbooks highlight national growth from immigrant labor while ignoring manipulation, restriction, and inequality. And the myth persists. We are taught that American immigration policy has always been fair and inclusive. Reality? Access has been selective, discriminatory, and politically strategic. Textbooks prefer uplifting stories over uncomfortable historical truths. So the next time someone claims American immigration policy has always been fair and inclusive, remember this. It hasn't. Policy has been selective, exclusionary, and often biased. Textbooks favor inspirational narratives over the messy, uneven reality of access. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 39. Take a deep breath, because the final myth will reveal how American wealth distribution is often presented as equitable while inequality has grown for centuries. You open your textbook and see a skyline of gleaming skyscrapers, bustling cities, and captions like "Economic growth in America has lifted everyone's standard of living." You're meant to think, wealth is fairly shared, opportunity is universal, and prosperity touches all citizens equally. Simple. Comforting. Tidy. Step closer. Reality is far messy. Wealth in America has always been concentrated, often inherited, and shaped by systemic inequality. Textbooks love stories of national growth, booming industries, and rising GDP, rarely showing who actually benefits. Imagine a factory town in the late 19th century. Industrialists and investors amass enormous fortunes. Workers toil 12-hour days, barely earning enough for basic survival. Textbooks highlight economic expansion, ignoring the massive wealth gap and social hardships. Even in the 20th century, periods of prosperity were uneven. The post-World War II boom created opportunities primarily for white families. Redlining, discriminatory lending, and unequal education prevented Black, Indigenous, and immigrant families from accumulating wealth at the same rate. Textbooks celebrate the American middle class, while omitting systemic exclusions. You picture a modern household. Two families work equally hard. One owns a home, savings, and investments. The other struggles with debt, unstable jobs, and rising costs. The playing field was never level, and wealth accumulation has consistently favored the privileged. Wealth concentration also shapes politics, policy, and power. Corporations influence legislation. Inheritance consolidates advantage across generations. Textbooks present GDP growth or median income as if these numbers tell the whole story. They don't. You might imagine the richest Americans in Silicon Valley or Wall Street. Their wealth grows exponentially, often untaxed or sheltered. Meanwhile, millions live paycheck to paycheck. Textbooks focus on national prosperity metrics, skipping the human consequences of inequality. And the myth persists. We are taught that economic growth benefits everyone equally. Reality? Wealth is highly concentrated, opportunity is unequal, and systemic barriers maintain inequality. Textbooks prefer tidy numbers and inspiring stories over uncomfortable social truths. So the next time someone claims American wealth has always been equitably distributed, remember this. It hasn't. Inequality has persisted for centuries, despite narratives of universal prosperity. Textbooks favor simplicity and optimism over messy, inconvenient realities. Congrats! You've unlearned myth number 40. Take a deep breath. Lean back. Reflect. Because the story of America is not a tidy list of victories. It's uneven, complicated, and profoundly human. The myths are gone. replaced with something heavier, truer, and infinitely more interesting.